So, I know that some of this video's content will seem fairly obvious to some of the more experienced players watching it, but I actually want to take an episode and cover which elements and status effects are worth using on sniper rifles. You see, snipers are slightly different from a lot of other weapons in how powerful each status effect is on them due to their slow speed, their built-in punch-through, and most importantly their high damage, and at least one element that I see suggested a lot, especially on the Lanka, isn't really all that useful on it or in fact anything else in the class. Furthermore, one of the best status effects for snipers is generally kind of underwhelming on a lot of other weapons, and so doesn't often get seriously looked into by a lot of newer players and even a few of the more experienced ones. And finally, since snipers are the go-to eidolon killers, I've got to fit a quick explanation about which elements to use for eidolons somewhere into this overall guide, so yeah. While I fully expect quite a few people to not really need this episode all that much, I still want to quickly break down the various status effects and elements and when or if you should consider using them when running with a sniper. But actually, before we talk about status effects or the individual elements, I want to quickly take a moment and talk about the effectiveness of damage types as a whole, as it's sort of useful for snipers, but also tends to either get under or overemphasized depending on who you are talking to. You see, having a damage type that enemies are weak to may give you up to a 75% damage increase, but on a lot of weapons this really isn't all that important once armor comes into play. It doesn't matter whether your super is built for alloy piercing radiation damage or absolutely useless magnetic damage, it's still not going to do much against a level 155 bombard when compared to either armor ignoring bleed effects or Corrosive's armor removal. But for snipers, they do enough raw damage that their damage numbers don't really tend to get rounded down much by armor, so if you've got the right element equipped, you will definitely notice. Even though that level 155 bombard is wearing more alloy plate than I've collected in the last 1000 hours of gameplay, a fully charged radiation Lanka is still going to delete him fairly quickly, while a magnetic one's 50% loss in damage is going to be very noticeable. However, that doesn't mean that I'd actually suggest leaning on a specific element to help you kill things through raw damage, as that tends to only usually help with one of a faction's dangerous enemies and not any of the others. Radiation might delete that bombard, but it's not going to do any sort of bonus damage against a heavy gunner, and Corrosive's got the same issue but reversed. And that same general sort of problem is something that you will face when up against any of the factions in the game. So basically what I'm trying to say here is that, yes, you can build a specific element so that you can delete heavy gunners or bombards or bursts or whatever faster. It is a decent option, but despite snipers really getting a lot of benefit from elemental damage boosts, I still highly suggest that when you build a sniper that's not meant for fighting status immune bosses like the eidolons, you build it with a useful status effect in mind rather than focusing on getting really high damage numbers against one specific dangerous type of enemy. Especially since if you want to one-shot something that's armored, your sniper should have access to that already with slash procs thanks to Hunter Munitions. All snipers have somewhere between good to amazing crit stats and enormous damage, and the bleeds caused by Hunter Munitions take all of that power into account when deciding how much damage they do, and also completely ignore the enemy's armor, so chances are if you headshot something with a sniper and Hunter Munitions procs, that enemy is either dead or at least seriously damaged regardless of its level, your element, or how weak your sniper rifle is. So yes, this is the most important status effect for high level content, and as I will be saying again tomorrow in the actual modding video, you should have Hunter Munitions on every single sniper build that is not meant for bosses. As for the elemental combos, Viral's definitely a good choice and pretty easy to explain. Its effect cuts in half the enemy's max health, doesn't require multiple hits to reach its full power, works very well with both Hunter Munitions and the class's generally high damage output, and just sort of lends itself to Sniper's whole one-shot, one-kill thing. Though, there is actually another status effect that's worth considering here that can give you more than one kill per shot. Gas is actually a legitimately good status effect on snipers thanks to, well, quite a lot of things coming together nicely. First, Sniper's built-in punch-through means that gas can sometimes proc from multiple enemies per shot, and so can sometimes double or more its damage if the enemies are standing close enough to each other and you get multiple procs. Also, the high damage of snipers in general increases the effect of the gas, and the gas goes up even further thanks to the zoom and combo multipliers, as well as any headshots or critical hits that you land. And while gas does tend to have issues against armored enemies, it still often does enough raw damage to be useful until extremely high levels, especially if you've got a good combo multiplier or are combining it with things like corrosive projection. And finally, since all snipers should have Hunter Munitions, which is already fully capable of killing bombards and other heavily armored targets on its own, even when you reach the point where gas stops being useful against the tankiest types of enemies, you will still have Hunter Munitions to help shred them, and you will still be blasting and likely killing everything around and behind the tank you're targeting with gas procs, and so yes, gas will still have some value even at pretty high levels. That's not to say that gas is undeniably the best option. Viral is very good because it does tend to handle high-level armored targets significantly better, but gas is still a very competitive option overall, and you should test out both of these elements to see which one you personally prefer. Now, speaking of armor, let's have a talk about Corrosive and why it's generally not going to be actually all that amazing on any of the snipers, including the Lanka. Corrosive's armor stripping is not tied to the damage of the hit, but rather the first time Corrosive procs, it reduces the enemy's armor by 25%. The second time it hits, it reduces the remaining armor by 25%, and the third time it reduces what's left by 25%, and so on and so forth. This means that the first few hits sound incredible, yes, but there's a few issues when talking about Corrosive with snipers. First, reducing a huge amount of armor by 25% doesn't actually matter nearly as much as you would expect. Stacked armor has a weird sort of diminishing returns, which means you actually need to have a lot of Corrosive procs to start getting much effect from it. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, think of something with 10,000 armor. That thing would have 97% damage reduction thanks to all that armor. Now, the first 3 Corrosive procs that you get will strip almost 6,000 armor off of that target, but unfortunately this is less effective than it sounds, as it only reduces their actual damage reduction by 4% down to a total of 93% damage reduction. Meanwhile, if you've hit that same enemy with 9 procs, your very next shot will reduce his total damage reduction by 6% on its own. So yes, while you can technically double your damage by landing just 3 Corrosive procs, your next hit will still only do about 7% of your weapon's actual damage. And unfortunately, you probably will not be stacking Corrosive all that fast. Snipers do not have the best fire rate. I mean, you can increase their fire rate with mods and such to get a decent speed, but you still won't be turning them into chain guns, and while multi-shot is a very good stat for them thanks to the way that Hunter Munitions works and the value of getting just 1 bleed when using something that does this kind of damage, you still won't be able to reliably increase your chance to proc Corrosive to a significant enough degree to be useful unless you are using something like a max status Vectus Prime, which is not something that I would ever suggest actually using. So yes, basically Corrosive requires a lot of procs to be effective, and snipers are physically incapable of really applying that. Especially since, yes, you will be wanting to run Hunter Munitions, and if you're dealing with something that has that kind of armor, chances are their health isn't actually impressive, so if you get a slash proc, which remember, these ignore armor, you will probably kill that enemy, and your chances of getting at least one such Hunter Munitions proc within the first 3 or 4 shots is generally quite high on pretty much every sniper, unless you forget Point Strike or something. So yes, for snipers, Corrosive's armor stripping is basically useless. You can get some really impressive numbers with Corrosive snipers like the Lanka when dealing with the right enemies due to the damage type being correct, but since you can't actually really stack Corrosive effectively and are almost never going to hit an enemy more than the 3 or 4 times required to proc Hunter Munitions, you're probably still going to be better off just using that mod along with either Viral or Gas. As for the status effects and elements that are left, they can all be talked about pretty quickly. Magnetic is worthless because gas is simply going to be the better option in all cases. It's useful against things that don't have shields, and against those guys, well, it bypasses the shields that magnetic just weakens. This will generally kill that enemy or at least severely damage them, so yes, it's really hard to find an actual use for magnetic damage. Radiation's damage type is extremely useful against the Eidolons, and you will definitely want to build it for them, but the status effect is really pretty poor in normal combat because you'll mainly be hitting only 1 or 2 enemies per shot, and you should outright be killing them most of the time, so confusing them doesn't really help much. Blast is hilarious when using it with things like the Lanka because it can knock down entire hallways, but that isn't actually useful when you could just kill or damage everything with a good enough gas effect. And as for the base elements, Cold applies a slow that can make headshots easier to land and makes your dots from Hunter Munitions last slightly longer, so it's not a terrible option, but it's not exactly thrilling either. Toxin is basically going to be single target gas damage with all of its positives and negatives, and so if you can get gas instead, it's simply going to be the better option. Fire is basically the same thing as Toxin, but it doesn't stack and instead provides a minor form of crowd control that can also make it hard to land a headshot if you are not used to it. And electricity causes the enemies to be temporarily paralyzed in an area, which can make for extremely easy headshots, but it only lasts for about 1 second, so yeah. If your build is going to be using an uncombined element for some reason, I would honestly probably suggest cold more than any of the others, but snipers do enough damage that there's usually not a lot of reasons to build more than just 2 elemental mods, unless you are trying to amplify gas damage with something like an extra toxin mod. Finally, Impact, Puncture, and Slash are not really worth building for, as all of their status effects are fairly worthless, or in Slash's case have such low base amounts that you can't effectively amplify them on current snipers. But yeah, unless you're using the Lanka, you will have at least one of these effects proc occasionally due to your weapon's base damage. The only good thing about modding for any of these is that you can technically get a lot of damage out of Puncture and Impact enhancing mods on the Rubko, the Volcar, and the Snipetron, as these weapons have very high percentages of either Impact or Puncture damage on them, but neither of the status effects tied to either of those elements are particularly exciting, so I wouldn't really suggest that you build for them. And yeah, I think that covers everything you might need to know about sniper statuses and elements. Radiation damage is the most important for Eidolon hunts, gas and viral are great statuses, corrosive's usable but not amazing, and Hunter Munitions bleeds are going to be by far the best status effect you will get on anything in this class. As always, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you learned anything, leave a like and subscribe, and I will see you tomorrow. Farewell.